They called it Operation Pluto, a secret, a lie. It was supposed to be a surgical strike, a whisper of change. Instead, it became a scream of failure, the ultimate symbol of Cold War bungling. The United States had never been so publicly humiliated. Not like this. We have to go back to 1959. The air in Havana was thick with revolution. A new leader had emerged, Fidel Castro. He was a firebrand, a revolutionary. He swept away the old guard. He seized power. He took American property. The communist threat was now 90 miles from Florida. An outrage. An insult. For President Dwight D. Eisenhower, this was unacceptable. Cuba had to be taken back. The CIA was given a singular mission: remove Castro. They found their soldiers among the angry, exiled Cubans in Miami. Men who had lost everything. Men who wanted revenge. They were willing to die for it. They were ready for the invasion. But the planners made fatal errors. 3 crucial mistakes that didn't just hurt the mission, they doomed it. Welcome to Shadows of History, where the past speaks. Cut, unfiltered, uncensored. The CIA's plan was simple. Dangerously simple. They would train a small, dedicated army, Brigade 2506. This force would land in Cuba. They would seize a beachhead. They would establish a temporary government. But the real plan? That was based on a fantasy. The CIA believed the landing would be a spark. They were certain the Cuban people hated Castro. They believed that people would rise up, that citizens and defecting soldiers would flood the ranks of the invaders. This would turn a small beach landing into a full-scale national revolt. Castro would fall. The training began in secret Guatemalan camps. The Cuban exiles were hardened. They were prepared for combat. The initial goal was the town of Trinidad. It had mountains nearby, a perfect retreat point. But then everything changed. President John F. Kennedy inherited the plan. He was new. He was nervous. He wanted plausible deniability. The Trinidad location was too big. Too public. He rejected it. The invasion had to be quieter. The CIA scrambled for a new site. They chose a remote, desolate location, Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. This change was the first tremor of the coming disaster. The new landing zone was a logistical nightmare, but the CIA ignored the warnings. They clung to the fantasy of the uprising. They believed the sheer act of landing would secure victory. They were wrong. The invasion began with a deception. On April 15, 1961, 8 US B-26 bombers, painted with fake Cuban Air Force markings, struck 3 airfields. The mission was to destroy Castro's tiny air force. It was a partial success. Enough to make Kennedy nervous. The press instantly identified the planes as American supplied. The story broke globally. Kennedy was furious. He was obsessed with masking us involvement. He feared a larger war with the Soviet Union. His political cover was already blown. The second, critical airstrike was scheduled for the morning of April 16th. It was supposed to finish the job. It was to destroy the few remaining Cuban planes. Those planes were the biggest threat to the landing force. The CIA was ready to launch, but President Kennedy intervened. He was sitting in Washington, D.C. He was surrounded by advisors. He was making a military decision based on political optics. He abruptly canceled the second airstrike. The CIA pleaded. The field commanders warned. They argued this decision guaranteed disaster. Without air supremacy, the brigade was defenseless on the water. Kennedy held firm. He feared the political outcry. This was mistake number 1. It was a fatal, command-level error. The few surviving Cuban T-33 jets and Sea Furies became the unchallenged masters of the air. They were primitive, but they were all Castro needed. They would fly low over the bay. They would hunt the invasion fleet. They would pick them apart. The brigade was now sailing toward a kill zone. The invasion force, Brigade 2506, hit the beaches on the morning of April 17, 1961. They landed at Playa Girón and Playa Larga. The weather was rough. The element of surprise was already compromised. The initial hope began to crumble immediately. The local militia, the Cuban army, was not surprised. Castro had been warned. The initial defenders were small, but they fought back hard. They refused to run. The fantasy of the mass uprising died on the beach. The worst threat came from the sky. Castro's remaining planes, the ones Kennedy had spared, arrived. They were unchallenged. They targeted the supply ships anchored offshore. The planes began a merciless bombing run. One ship was hit, then another. Then the Houston was sunk. She carried 17,000 barrels of fuel and a critical cache of ammunition. The invaders watched in horror as their lifeline sank beneath the waves. Their ammunition was now limited. Their fuel was gone. They had no retreat. Their position was immediately unsustainable. The men of Brigade 2506 fought like lions. They did capture the small airstrip at Playa Girón. They pushed back the initial Cuban advances. They secured a fragile beachhead, but they were now trapped, isolated. Their enemy was already mobilizing the full might of the state. It was no longer an invasion. It was a siege. The trap was set. The second catastrophic error was the choice of location itself. The Bay of Pigs was chosen for its secrecy, but secrecy came with a deadly price. Geographical isolation. The landing zone was nestled in the Zapata Peninsula. This entire area is a vast, unforgiving swamp. The Ciénaga de Zapata. It is one of the largest wetlands in the Caribbean. A terrible, dense marshland. This swamp created a natural bottleneck. There were only 3 narrow roads leading out of the landing zone. 3 roads that connected the beachhead to the Cuban interior. The invaders needed to quickly break out. They needed to link up with anti-Castro rebels. They needed to find the mountains. The swamp made this impossible. The advancing Cuban army only needed to control those 3 roads. They didn't need to fight in the dense jungle. They simply had to block the exits. Any attempt by the brigade to bypass the roads meant drowning in the muck. It meant being bogged down in the endless mud. The swamps were also home to Castro's forces. They knew the land. They had small boats. They could move around the invaders' flanks. They could launch surprise attacks. The beautiful, quiet waters of the Bay of Pigs were a deadly illusion. They represented a dead end. The brigade could not maneuver. They could not retreat. They could not be reinforced. The swamp became a massive natural prison. The invaders were pinned against the sea. They were now fighting for survival, not for a revolution. They were alone. Fidel Castro was not an indecisive man. The second the invasion was confirmed, he acted with lightning speed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't panic. He understood the stakes. He had to crush this landing before the uprising. Fentuzzi could become a reality. Castro personally took command of the counteroffensive. He didn't trust his generals. He drove to the front lines. He organized the defense. This move had a massive impact on the morale of his troops. The Cuban army mobilized thousands of loyalist troops. They were quickly supported by heavy Soviet-supplied armor. Tanks, artillery, these were weapons the brigade, relying on CIA's assurances, had not been equipped to fight. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. The brigade was a force of about 1,400 men. Castro was throwing 20,000 soldiers and militiamen at the beachhead. It was a mismatch, a slaughter in the making. The Cuban artillery began to pound the landing zone. The tanks rolled down the 3 narrow roads. They encountered fierce resistance from the desperate exiles. But the brigade's light weapons could not stop the armor. They didn't have the anti-tank weapons they desperately needed. The fight was brutal. The exiles fought for their families, for their freedom. But every hour brought more Cuban troops, more guns, more ammunition. The tide was turning irreversibly. By the end of the second day, the brigade was shattered. They were out of everything, out of hope. On the second and third days of fighting, the reality set in. The brigade was collapsing. They radioed their CIA handlers. They pleaded for help. They were begging for the promised air cover. They were begging for us Marines. President Kennedy was now facing the ultimate test. He had canceled the second airstrike. He had chosen the wrong location. Now, he had to decide, cut and run or commit. His advisors were split. Some argued for a full intervention. They said the U.S. could not abandon its soldiers, even proxy soldiers. Others argued that a direct U.S. military intervention would shatter the Soviet peace. It would look like an act of war. It could trigger World War III to Kennedy, chose deniability over victory. He chose non-intervention over saving the men he had sent to die. He authorized a single, tiny act of support. 6 unmarked fighter jets to fly cover for 1 hour. They arrived too late. The fight was over. The order was reversed. This was mistake number 3, the lack of political will. The American president had sent men into an impossible battle, then abandoned them when the going got tough. He feared the Soviet reaction more than he cared for the men fighting under the American flag. The signal was devastating. The Soviet Union watched. Castro watched. The world watched. The US was not willing to fight for its allies. It was not willing to commit to its own plans. This single decision sealed the fate of the invasion. It meant total surrender. The men of Brigade 2506 were left to face the full wrath of Fidel Castro's justice. The final hours of the invasion were pure chaos. The invaders realized no help was coming. They ran out of ammunition. They began to surrender. Over 1,100 men of Brigade 2506 were captured. Nearly 120 were killed in action. Castro had won, decisively. The US was mortified. The CIA was publicly disgraced. Kennedy was forced to take full responsibility. He stated, "Victory has 100 fathers, and defeat is an orphan." But the world knew the truth. Castro paraded the captured exiles on television. He turned the disaster into a massive, global propaganda victory. The US had tried to overthrow him. They had failed. His revolution was now stronger. He demanded a massive ransom, $53 million in food and medical supplies. The US eventually paid. The Bay of Pigs was a humiliation, but it was far more than that. It directly led to a crisis 10 times worse. The Soviets, seeing Kennedy's lack of resolve, believed he was weak. A paper tiger, they decided to seize the advantage. Less than 18 months later, the Soviets began secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Bay of Pigs' failure created the conditions for the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world came within hours of nuclear annihilation, all because of 3 simple, fatal mistakes. The Bay of Pigs was a perfect storm of planning arrogance, political fear, and military bungling. It cost lives. It empowered a dictator. It proved that a powerful nation can be defeated by its own fear of commitment. What other infamous blunders shaped the world we live in? Let me know in the comments below. And subscribe to Shadows of History. Hit that bell for more uncut, unfiltered, uncensored history.